If nobody else will stand for you, I will. The words left Ethan Cole's mouth before his brain had the good sense to stop them. For half a second, the whole transit corridor seemed to hold its breath. Red emergency strips pulsed along the ceiling. Recycled air hissed through the vents with the sharp, metallic smell of ozone and overheated wiring. Somewhere behind the bulkhead, a cargo clamp groaned hard enough to vibrate through the floor plates and into Ethan's boots. He had been on his way to fix a coolant relay on Dock Ring C, carrying a dented toolbox in one hand and a lukewarm coffee in the other, when he saw the crowd gathered around the checkpoint gate. Port security. Station staff. A few dockworkers slowing down just enough to stare. And in the center of all that attention, on her knees beneath the white spill of a scanner beam, was the alien woman everyone had already decided did not belong. She was taller than most of the people around her even like that, though exhaustion bent her shoulders and made her look smaller than she was. Her skin held that blue-green sheen some off-world species carried, like sea glass under winter light. One sleeve of her travel wrap had been torn open at the wrist, revealing a restraint mark, dark and clean against the shimmer of her skin. Her hair, pale silver with a faint green cast under the station lights, had fallen across one side of her face, but Ethan could still see her expression well enough. Not panic. Not pleading. Just the kind of stillness that came when a person understood exactly how little mercy the room had left to offer. "Step back, civilian," one of the officers snapped when Ethan moved closer. The man's voice came flat through a clipped helmet mic, practiced and tired. Ethan should have listened. He knew that. He was a maintenance tech with a patchy employment record, overdue rent, and exactly zero pull with station authority. His station badge opened storage hatches and repair tunnels, not hearts. But there was something in the way the woman lifted her chin, even with 3 scanners pointed at her and everyone talking about her like she was freight, that made an old promise stir in his chest like heat under ash. Years ago, in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and paper cups, his younger sister had squeezed his hand and asked him why people always waited for someone more important to do the decent thing. Ethan had never found a good answer. He still hadn't. So he set the coffee down on the floor, tightened his grip on the toolbox until the metal handle bit into his palm, and stepped into the ring of light. "She's under my word now," he said, and the officer actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because on Meridian Gate Station, a promise from a man like Ethan Cole was worth less than a signed cargo receipt. The laughter spread in small, embarrassed ripples through the crowd. Someone muttered that humans were reckless. Someone else called him stupid. The alien woman finally looked straight at him then, and her eyes stopped him colder than the station draft ever could. They were bright, almost colorless at first glance, then full of quiet depth when the light caught them. Not grateful. Not trusting. Measuring. Like she couldn't decide whether he was brave, broken, or simply another fool about to make her life worse. "Do you even know what she is?" the officer asked. Ethan swallowed. He could taste burnt dust and stale coffee at the back of his throat. "No," he said. "I know what you're doing." Silence again. A cargo horn boomed somewhere far below, low and heavy, echoing up through the structure like distant thunder. The officer turned his tablet around and held it out. Temporary civilian bond transfer. Financial liability. Harboring clause. Employment review. Housing suspension pending investigation. Ethan scanned the list once, and his stomach dropped inch by inch. Every box was a door that could slam shut behind him. His job. His bunk. His access code. The little life he'd kept stitched together with overtime and duct tape. He should have backed off. He should have told himself it wasn't his business. Instead, he took the stylus, signed his name, and felt the station change around him, as if some unseen mechanism had just locked into place. When he handed the tablet back, the alien woman rose slowly to her feet. Up close, she smelled faintly of cold air and ionized metal, like a storm walking indoors. "Why?" she asked, her voice low and perfectly steady. Ethan looked at her, at the restraint mark on her wrist and the way every eye in the corridor was still waiting for him to realize his mistake, and gave the only answer he had. Because nobody should have to beg to be treated like a person. The scanner lights dimmed. Somewhere overhead, a warning chime began to ring. And Ethan had the sudden, sinking feeling that the promise he had just made was about to cost him far more than he could afford. The warning chime did not stop after a few seconds the way routine alerts usually did. It kept ringing in a measured, irritating pattern as Ethan Cole retrieved his toolbox from the floor and watched the officer tap 3 final commands into the tablet. A thin amber band flashed across Ethan's station badge, replacing the familiar blue access stripe with something far less reassuring. Temporary review status. Limited movement. Restricted payroll. He did not need to read the small print to know what that meant. It meant the next time he tried to buy dinner, the machine might politely refuse him. It meant his supervisor would get a notice before Ethan reached dock ring C. It meant the little bunk he rented above the coolant exchangers might no longer be his by morning. The corridor around him slowly came back to life. Boots started moving again. Carts rolled forward. Conversations resumed in hushed, hungry tones, the way people talked when they were relieved that somebody else's bad decision was not their own. Ethan bent to pick up his coffee, then looked at the cup, now cold and sloshing against the lid, and dropped it into a recycler slot instead. When he straightened, the alien woman was still there, no longer kneeling, no longer under the scanner beam, but not exactly free either. Freedom should have looked lighter than that. "You can go," the officer said to her, though his attention stayed fixed on Ethan. "If he keeps you out of trouble, his name stays on the file. If not, we know where to collect." Ethan gave a small nod like he understood the rules and hated how dry his mouth felt. The woman turned her head toward him with a restraint that was somehow sharper than anger. Up close, he could see the fine shimmer at the edge of her throat where the station lights caught her skin, and the faint tremor she was working hard not to show. She had probably been cold for hours. Meridian Gate liked its public corridors crisp and overventilated, especially near customs. "This way," Ethan said, then immediately wondered why he sounded like he was inviting a stranger into his own disaster. She did not move. "You signed without asking my name," she said. Her voice was smooth, low, and so controlled that it made everyone else's sound careless by comparison. "That is either rare courage or very poor judgment." Ethan adjusted the weight of the toolbox in his hand. "I have been accused of worse." One corner of her mouth shifted, not enough to become a smile. "That, I believe." They started walking. He kept his pace steady, not too fast, not so slow that security might rethink the release. The corridor curved toward the service elevators, away from the polished storefronts and passenger lounges and deeper into the parts of the station most travelers never saw. Here the air changed. Less perfume and engine coolant cover scent, more hot metal, detergent, and the bitter bite of recycled steam. Pipes ran exposed along the ceiling. Vibration thrummed through the deck in long mechanical breaths. Ethan knew this part of the station the way some people knew neighborhoods back on Earth. Which doors stuck in humid weather? Which vents rattled at midnight? Which camera near Lift Bank 4 had been broken for 6 months because no one in management wanted to pay to replace it? He punched the elevator call panel with his knuckle. Nothing happened. Restricted badge. Of course. He exhaled through his nose and led her toward the maintenance stairwell instead. "You just lost your access, did not you?" she said. Not mocking. Simply observant. Ethan glanced at the dead panel. "Some of it. And still you continue." The stairwell door opened with a groan that echoed upward into darkness. Cool air washed over them, smelling faintly of dust and machine oil. Ethan held the door and finally looked at her directly. "You asked my name without saying yours." For the first time, something in her expression softened, not into trust but into a decision. "Lyra," she said. "Lyra Vale." Ethan nodded once. All right, Lyra. I do not know what they wanted from you, and right now I do not need to. But the lower service decks are warm, quiet, and mostly ignored by people who enjoy paperwork. So until I figure out what this promise of mine just cost me, that is where we are going. She studied him for a long second as the alarm still chimed somewhere far above them, patient as fate. On my world, she said at last, stepping through the doorway, a promise is not spoken unless the speaker is willing to be broken by it. Ethan followed her into the stairwell, the heavy door closing behind them with a hollow steel thud. Then it is a good thing, he said, that humans are stubborn. The stairwell spiraled down through the belly of Meridian Gate like the inside of an old machine, all steel ribs and humming walls, each landing washed in a tired yellow light that made everything look one shift away from failure. Ethan Cole took the steps two at a time at first, running on nerves more than confidence, then slowed when he realized Lyra Vale was matching him without effort despite whatever exhaustion she was hiding. The air grew warmer as they descended, thicker too, threaded with the smell of hot dust, lubricants, and the faint mineral tang of recycled water moving through old pipes. Somewhere below, a pressure valve released with a long tired hiss, and the sound echoed up the shaft like a giant thing breathing in its sleep. Ethan knew these levels better than most people knew their own kitchens. Deck 12 was where the filtration pumps froze every winter cycle. Deck 14 had a vending machine that only dispensed crackers if you kicked the panel just right. Deck 16, where he was taking her now, had a retired maintenance bay nobody used except a few night crews and one electrician who liked to nap behind supply crates. It was not home, but it was quiet, and quiet counted for a lot on a station built out of noise. His badge chirped at the next security plate and flashed amber again. Restricted. He swore under his breath and keyed in a manual bypass code from memory. The door hesitated, then unlocked with a grudging click. Lyra noticed everything. He could tell from the way her pale eyes tracked the keypad, the camera above the frame, the crack in the corner where the casing had warped from heat years ago. You have done this before, she said. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped into a service corridor lined with conduit bundles and insulated coolant lines. What, broken into places I already have to repair. He shifted the toolbox to his other hand. Only on weekdays. She looked at him then, properly looked, as if trying to decide where humor fit inside a species that made promises to strangers and jokes in the middle of consequences. You should not do that, she said. Make light of danger when you can already feel it. Ethan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. That is usually when I do my best work. They walked in silence for another 30 yards. Overhead, the lights flickered once and settled. The corridor narrowed near the old bay entrance, where one wall still carried scorch marks from an electrical fire Ethan remembered fixing 2 summers ago. His tablet vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw 3 messages stacked on the lock screen. One from payroll. One from housing services. One from his supervisor, Marta, with the kind of subject line that always meant trouble. Report to admin before end of shift. Ethan stared for a second too long. Lyra's voice came softly beside him. The damage is spreading. He slipped the tablet away. That is one way to put it. The retired maintenance bay opened up beyond the corridor like a forgotten garage, dim and cavernous, with idle lift frames parked along the wall and a single portable heater glowing orange near a workbench. The air inside was warmer by at least 10 degrees, warm enough to take the edge off the station chill. Ethan crossed to the heater and nudged the setting higher. The fan coughed, rattled, then settled into a low steady whir. Sit, he said, pointing to a crate beside the bench. It is not comfortable, but neither is the rest of my life, so we work with what we have. Lyra did not sit right away. She turned slowly, taking in the bay, the spare parts, the stacked sealant cans, the maintenance notes Ethan had left half attached to a panel weeks ago. Her shoulders eased by the smallest fraction. You hide in plain machinery, she said. I work in plain machinery, Ethan corrected. Hiding is new. At that, something almost human crossed her face. Not amusement exactly. More like the memory of it. She lowered herself onto the crate with the controlled care of someone determined not to reveal pain. Under the warmer light, he could see the strain in her more clearly now. The faint pallor beneath the blue-green of her skin. The stiffness in the hand she kept near her side. The exhaustion she had been holding together with nothing but discipline. Ethan set down the toolbox, popped the latches, and began sorting through thermal wraps, patch tape, and a portable diagnostics reader. Before you say it, he murmured, I know this looks like a terrible plan. Lyra watched him, very still. No, she said. A terrible plan would have been walking away. That stopped him for a moment. Only a moment. Then his tablet vibrated again, harder this time, with a station-wide notice sliding across the screen in bright official text. Civilian bond active. Protected individual flagged for retrieval review. Report all unusual movement in lower maintenance sectors. Ethan felt the warmth of the heater on his hands and the cold drop through his stomach all at once. Someone had started looking below decks already, and far sooner than they should have. The message glowed on Ethan Cole's screen for 3 long seconds before he locked the tablet and set it face down on the workbench like that might somehow make the problem smaller. It did not. The portable heater rattled beside him, pushing out dry heat that smelled faintly of old dust and scorched filter mesh. Somewhere behind the far wall, a circulation pump kicked on with a low mechanical thrum, and the sound rolled through the retired bay like distant thunder trapped inside steel. Ethan could feel every inch of the station around them now, every vent, every cable, every camera node waking up and turning its blind electronic attention toward the lower decks. He reached into the toolbox and pulled out a small diagnostics wand, more out of habit than certainty, then crouched near the bay door and checked the access plate. Amber status light. Passive scan only for now. That would not last. How quickly do your people usually move when they decide to reclaim someone? He asked without looking up. Lyra Vale remained seated on the crate, both hands folded in her lap with the kind of stillness that looked practiced rather than peaceful. Under the orange heater glow, her skin no longer looked cold enough to crack, but the strain had not left her face. Fast enough to make examples, she said. Slow enough to preserve appearances. Ethan glanced back at her. That is a very diplomatic way to describe something bad. It is a diplomatic station, she replied. Everyone here prefers elegant words for ugly intentions. That landed harder than he expected. He stood, walked to a storage locker built into the wall, and forced it open with his shoulder when the latch stuck. Inside were spare thermal wraps, a pair of work gloves, 2 sealed water pouches, and a maintenance smock with the station logo half peeled away. He tossed the smock to Lyra. Put that on. It will not fool anybody close up, but it might buy us a second if someone glances through a camera feed. She caught it cleanly and examined the faded fabric with open skepticism. You dress your engineers like this? Only the handsome ones. For the first time, the corner of her mouth lifted enough to become an actual smile, quick and small and gone so fast he wondered if the heater light had invented it. She drew the smock over her shoulders anyway, covering the travel wrap beneath. It hung loose on her, but the station gray dulled the unmistakable elegance of her silhouette, made her look less like someone important and more like one more tired worker at the end of a long shift. Ethan handed her a water pouch. Drink. She accepted it but did not open it right away. You give orders easily for a man with no authority. Ethan let out a breath through his nose as he moved back to the bench and started gathering what they could carry. Patch tape. Mini lamp. Spare access coupler. Protein bars that were probably older than he wanted to know. That is because I am not giving orders, he said. I am improvising in a highly convincing tone. Lyra twisted the pouch seal and drank. He pretended not to notice how careful she was with each swallow, as if her body had been running on discipline longer than food. His own stomach reminded him he had skipped lunch, but hunger felt like a luxury compared to the pressure building under his ribs. The tablet buzzed again. This time it was Marta. He answered on audio only and kept his voice low. "I am on a job." Her sigh burst through the speaker sharp enough to cut wire. "You are the job, Ethan. Admin flagged you station-wide. Security wants to know why one of my maintenance techs decided to sponsor a customs incident." He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck and stared at the floor plates, at the familiar scratches and welded seams, at a life that had been simple 3 hours ago. "Can you stall them?" Silence. Then Marta, quieter now. "Not for long. They are sweeping service routes from the top down. If you are below deck 15, move." The line clicked dead. Ethan slipped the tablet into his pocket and looked toward the old lift shaft at the rear of the bay, the one everyone forgot because it no longer served passenger levels. It dropped another 6 decks into the utility spine, into the oldest part of Meridian Gate, where the air tasted like rust and history and most maps gave up trying to be accurate. He met Lyra's eyes. She had heard enough from his face alone. "We are leaving," he said. "Now." She rose smoothly, the oversized gray smock shifting around her like borrowed anonymity. Outside the bay, a distant announcement began to echo through the ventilation system, official and calm in exactly the way that made calm impossible. Ethan killed the heater, and at once the room seemed colder, barer, more honest. Then he grabbed the toolbox, reached for the manual lantern, and led her toward the dark old shaft, carrying with him the growing certainty that whatever had started in that bright customs corridor was no longer a misunderstanding. Someone important wanted Lyra found before she could reach whatever came next. The old lift shaft smelled like iron, old rain, and the kind of heat that had been trapped too long inside working metal. Ethan Cole swung the manual lantern once, sending a weak amber arc across the narrow cage and the exposed guide rails that dropped into shadow below. The bulb hummed softly in his hand. Dust glittered in the light like drifting filings. Somewhere deep under their feet, machinery pulsed in slow, patient cycles, each vibration traveling up through the shaft walls and into Ethan's palms as he gripped the service ladder. Meridian Gate had layers most passengers never imagined. They saw polished concourses, customs halls, diplomatic lounges, and observation glass. They did not see the spine beneath it all, the old bones that still carried power, water, heat, and the lives of every person aboard. Ethan had spent 5 years inside those bones. Tonight, for the first time, they felt less like a workplace and more like a hiding place. "Careful on the 3rd rung below the platform," he said quietly. "It shifts half an inch to the right." Lyra Vale stepped into the cage behind him, one hand grazing the rail, her station gray smock muting the luminous blue-green of her skin but not her presence. Even wrapped in borrowed fabric and poor lighting, she carried herself with a kind of contained gravity the station could not quite reduce. She looked down the shaft, then back at him. "You know every flaw in this structure." Ethan lowered himself onto the ladder and started down. "Only the ones that have tried to kill my schedule." The lantern threw long bars of light over the shaft walls as Lyra followed. Her movements were precise, economical, silent enough to make Ethan increasingly aware of his own boots scraping metal. After 2 landings the air turned heavier, warmer, touched with the mineral scent of condensers and the bitter edge of electrical insulation. His shirt clung to the back of his neck. A faint sheen of moisture gathered along the pipes running parallel to the shaft, catching the lantern light in narrow silver lines. At deck 19 he stopped beside a maintenance hatch no longer marked on current station maps. The access plate had been painted over twice and forgotten 3 times. He set the lantern on a rung, reached into his pocket for a bent torque key, and started working the stubborn panel bolts loose. Lyra watched his hands. "This is not on the official route." "That is the point." He leaned his shoulder into the hatch until the seal gave with a tired rubber groan. Warm air breathed out from the other side carrying the smell of wet metal, old coolant, and something faintly sweet from the hydroponics lines 2 decks over. Ethan lifted the lantern and ducked inside first. The passage beyond was narrow enough that his toolbox scraped the wall if he carried it wrong. Condensation ticked from overhead joints. Farther down, a bank of dormant maintenance screens reflected their light in dull green smears. "This tunnel connects to the utility spine," he said. "No cameras for another 100 feet, maybe more if central. Has not updated the grid." Lyra stepped in after him. The hatch eased shut behind them, and the sound of the station changed at once. The big public noises vanished. No announcements. No passing carts. No overhead chatter. Just water in pipes, the soft tick of cooling metal, and the quiet shared sound of two people breathing in a place not meant for anyone except repair crews and ghosts. Ethan kept moving until they reached a junction alcove where an old coolant manifold split into 4 insulated branches. There he finally set the toolbox down and braced a hand against the wall, more to steady the rush of thought than his body. "All right," he said, exhaling slowly. "We have a little time." "Not much, but some." Lyra did not answer immediately. She was studying the tunnel, the patched seams, the handwritten service marks, the improvised brackets Ethan himself had installed during one ugly winter outage. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before, stripped of the cold formal edge she had worn like armor. "You keep saying we." Ethan looked at her. The lantern glow caught pale green in her silver hair and drew a tired shadow beneath her eyes. "I signed for that privilege, remember? Most would already be calculating how to surrender me politely." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh on a better night. "Most people on this station have more sense than I do." For the first time since customs, Lyra did not challenge the joke. She took one small step closer to the manifold warmth, held her hands near the insulated pipe, and closed her eyes for just a second as if allowing herself to feel heat instead of merely surviving without it. Then she opened them and looked at him with something new in her expression, something quieter and far more dangerous than gratitude. "Respect." "Ethan," she said, speaking his name carefully, like something weighed before being offered, "they are not searching because they believe I am a criminal." He felt the station hum around them and knew, before she said another word, that whatever came next was going to make his promise heavier still. Lyra's words seemed to settle into the utility tunnel more heavily than the heat. Ethan Cole stood very still beside the coolant manifold, one hand braced against the damp steel wall, and listened to the soft layered sounds around them. Water moving through insulated lines. The distant hum of circulation turbines. The tiny electric buzz from his lantern where it hung on a pipe bracket and painted the narrow space in tired amber. Meridian Gate had always sounded alive to him, but now every noise carried a second meaning, as if the station itself were listening. "Then why are they searching?" he asked. Lyra did not answer at once. She stepped closer to the manifold, letting the warmth reach her through the thin gray maintenance smock. In the lantern light her blue-green skin looked less like polished glass now and more like something real and vulnerable, dulled by exhaustion, edged by strain. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the last of its ceremonial distance. "Because I saw something I was not meant to see." Ethan let that sit for a second. That is usually the part where people get very dramatic and say mysterious things. Her eyes lifted to him, pale and clear and far more tired than proud now. "You prefer plain language." "I work in maintenance. Plain language keeps the air on." That drew the faintest shift in her expression, not quite amusement, but close enough to warm the air between them. Lyra rested her fingertips against the insulated pipe, absorbing heat in silence before continuing. "There are ships approaching Meridian Gate. Not military ships. Refugee carriers. Old, overcrowded, failing in stages. They were promised safe corridor access through this sector." Ethan frowned. "Promised by who?" "By officials who profit from promises they do not intend to keep." The words landed cold despite the warmth around them. Ethan pictured the customs corridor again, the polished floors, the smooth voices, the kind of people who never touched grease or broken machinery unless there was a camera pointed at them. You are saying someone on this station sold those people a way through and plans to close the door when they get here. Not close it, Lyra said. Redirect it. Delay clearance. Increase fees. Divide the convoy. By the time any formal objection reaches the Central Worlds, lives will already have been bartered into debt and dependency. Ethan stared at her. He could almost smell the public levels above them now, all clean filters and expensive soap covering the rot underneath. And you know this because I was in a room where they believed no one of consequence was listening. Ethan gave a short breath of disbelief. You keep saying things like that, and somehow they never make me feel better. His tablet vibrated again in his pocket, insistent and unwelcome. He ignored it. Outside the tunnel, far off through layers of structure, a station tone chimed 3 times. Shift rotation. Midnight sector handoff. Normally that sound meant coffee, paperwork, and people pretending they had not already been tired for hours. Tonight it sounded like a clock starting. Lyra lowered her hand from the manifold. If those carriers arrive before the evidence reaches the right channel, thousands will be trapped in procedural mercy. Ethan rubbed a hand over his jaw, feeling the grit of a day that had somehow become much larger than him. And let me guess. You have the evidence. She reached beneath the maintenance smock, not with haste, but with the careful restraint of someone revealing a final card. From an inner seam she withdrew a thin crystal wafer no bigger than a stick of gum. It glimmered faintly in the lantern light, green at the edges, alive with stored data. Ethan knew enough station tech to understand what he was looking at. Secure transfer medium. Private. Traceable if activated wrong. Important enough to ruin lives. Maybe save them too. This contains contract logs, ship routing edits, payment authorizations, and internal approvals, Lyra said. Enough to expose everyone involved, if it reaches an independent relay. Ethan looked from the crystal to her face. And there is no chance at all that my evening gets simpler from here. No, she said quietly. There is not. He laughed once under his breath, not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was letting the fear settle into something permanent. Then he held out his hand. Lyra hesitated just long enough for him to notice. Not because she doubted the danger. Because she understood the meaning of giving it to him. When she placed the wafer in his palm, it felt almost weightless. Somehow that made it worse. Ethan closed his fingers around it and felt the full shape of his promise change. This was no longer one frightened stranger and one reckless human hiding below decks. This was a station built on polished lies, ships moving toward a trap, and a truth small enough to fit inside his hand. Above them, through all that metal and heat and distance, a new announcement began to roll across Meridian Gate in a calm official voice requesting all unauthorized maintenance personnel to identify themselves for immediate review. The announcement rolled faintly through the structure above them, filtered by steel, distance, and old insulation until the official voice sounded less like a person and more like the station itself clearing its throat. Ethan Cole slipped the crystal wafer into the inner pocket of his work shirt and sealed the flap with a strip of patch tape. It was a ridiculous hiding place for something that could expose half a sector, but ridiculous had already become the theme of his night. Lyra Vale watched the motion with a stillness that no longer felt suspicious. It felt measured, like she was recalculating him again and not entirely to his disadvantage. Ethan picked up the lantern and tilted it toward the branching tunnel ahead. There is an old relay nest about 200 feet down the utility spine, he said. It used to connect emergency service calls before central routing got modern and arrogant. Most of the hardware is dead, but 1 or 2 isolated uplinks may still breathe if I can persuade them. Lyra took a careful step away from the manifold warmth, and the effort showed this time. Her shoulders tightened. The fingers of her right hand flexed once, slow and stiff, before she tucked them against her side again. Ethan noticed because maintenance had trained him to notice everything that looked a little off and a lot expensive. You are not just tired, he said. She held his gaze for a second, then looked away toward the dark run of tunnel. My thermal regulator was damaged during detention. Ethan frowned. You're what? A bioadaptive implant. It helps my body manage severe environmental shifts. Cold, pressure changes, atmospheric imbalance. Her voice remained calm, but the calm had started to fray at the edges. Without proper stabilization, my systems compensate poorly. Ethan lowered the lantern and stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, only enough to see. At the base of her neck, just above the collar of the gray smock, a faint line of pale light flickered once beneath the skin and then dimmed. Not natural. Not cosmetic either. Functional. Failing. And you were planning to mention this when it became inconvenient to hide. He let out a soft, disbelieving breath. Lyra, everything about tonight is already inconvenient. She almost answered sharply, then stopped. Maybe because the heater warmth was fading behind them. Maybe because she knew he was right. Ethan set the lantern on a pipe bracket and opened the toolbox again. Inside, under sealant tubes and diagnostic leads, sat a compact field reader with adaptable probes meant for stubborn maintenance interfaces. It was not medical equipment. It was close enough for an underfunded station tech with bad ideas. Can I see it? He asked. Lyra hesitated. The tunnel hummed around them, the air heavy with the smell of warm metal and wet insulation. Then, with a visible act of trust, she moved the smock collar aside. The regulator port sat just behind her ear and down along the neckline, a delicate crescent of embedded crystal and conductive mesh, beautiful in the same accidental way exposed circuitry could be beautiful when it was doing something essential. One edge had darkened. The contact lattice looked scorched or overloaded. Ethan crouched slightly to bring the reader closer and tried not to think too hard about how one bad touch could make matters worse. This may sting, he said. That phrase appears to comfort humans more than the people hearing it, Lyra murmured. That is fair. He clipped a micro lead to the outer contact. The reader chirped, through a line of amber error text, then stabilized into a diagnostic pulse. Ethan adjusted the sensitivity dial with his thumb. A tiny static pop kissed his knuckle. He flinched. Lyra did not. You should let me do the reacting, she said quietly. I am the one attached to it. I am considering it. He leaned closer, reading the improvised output as best he could. Charge imbalance. Thermal cascade risk. Manual reset possible if external bridge applied. Okay, he murmured, more to himself than to her. You do not need a new implant tonight. You need the existing one reminded how to behave. From the bottom tray he pulled a flexible coupler, stripped the insulation with his multi-tool, and bridged two contact points on the reader with a length of copper filament. It was ugly work. Improvised. The kind Marta would have glared at for 10 straight minutes before admitting it might function. Ethan touched the makeshift bridge to the regulator mesh. This time the spark bit harder, sharp and hot against the side of his finger. He hissed and nearly dropped the lead, but held it steady. Lyra turned toward him at once. You are burned. Lightly offended, he said through his teeth. The regulator flared once beneath her skin, a soft band of green-blue light sweeping across the crescent, then settling into a steady low glow. The change in her was immediate and subtle all at once. Her breathing evened. The rigid line of her shoulders eased. Color returned, not brighter exactly, but deeper, more alive. Ethan sat back on his heels and shook his hand once to cool the sting. There, he said. Temporary patch. Not elegant, but neither am I. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her pale eyes unreadable in the lantern glow. Then she reached for his hand before he could tuck it away. Her touch was cool, careful, almost reverent as she turned his fingers to inspect the reddened knuckle. On my world, she said softly, people do not injure themselves to help strangers unless they expect a debt. Ethan met her gaze. The tunnel seemed quieter suddenly, as if even the pipes were listening. Then your world and mine keep different ledgers. Her eyes stayed on his for a second longer than before. No challenge in them now. No suspicion. Only the first fragile shape of understanding. Then, somewhere deeper in the utility spine, a hatch slammed shut with a metallic boom that rolled through the tunnel like a warning, and both of them turned toward the sound at the exact same time. The metallic boom rolled through the utility spine, then faded into a long uneasy silence broken only by the hush of moving water and the low electrical murmur from Ethan Cole's lantern. He rose from his crouch in one smooth motion, ignoring the sting in his knuckle, and lifted the light higher toward the dark stretch of tunnel ahead. The narrow walls caught the amber glow in wet streaks. Condensation slid down old insulation wraps and gathered at the seams like cold sweat. Somewhere beyond the next bend, a maintenance hatch had been closed with purpose, not by airflow or tired machinery. Ethan could tell the difference. Machines complained. People announced themselves with decisions. Lyra Vale let go of his hand, but not abruptly. The brief contact lingered in the air between them. Longer than it should have, and for one strange second Ethan became sharply aware of everything at once, the warmth still returning to her skin, the heat trapped in the pipes, the copper taste of anxiety at the back of his throat, and the fragile fact that trust had finally entered the tunnel with them. Search pattern, he said quietly. Either security found an old map, or someone with better clearance than station security is guiding them. Lyra turned toward the darkness, her expression composed again, though no longer cold. Then we should keep moving before the pattern learns us. Ethan picked up the toolbox, checked the patch tape seal over the pocket holding the crystal wafer, and started down the tunnel. The passage narrowed, then opened into an older section of the utility spine where the walls changed from smooth modern composite to riveted alloy plating darkened by decades of heat. Here the station felt older than its official age, more shipyard than diplomatic hub, built by people who believed strength meant thickness and repairability more than elegance. Ethan preferred these bones. They were honest. His lantern passed over faded maintenance markings from crews long gone, initials etched into sealant, dates scratched beside replaced valves, little human proofs that somebody had once been here at 3 a.m. trying to keep the world breathing. Lyra noticed him looking. You read walls, she said. I read whatever survives being ignored, Ethan replied. Most systems only fail because somebody important decided not to notice them. She was quiet for a few steps after that. Then she said, that is true of governments as well. He glanced sideways at her. I am starting to learn that. They reached a junction chamber no bigger than a walk-in closet, where 4 conduit trunks met beneath an old relay panel set into the wall. The casing was dented. Half the indicator lights were dead. Dust had gathered in the corners around the screws. Ethan set the lantern on a bracket, popped open the panel, and let out a soft breath of relief when he saw one bank still had residual standby current. Faint. Unstable. Enough to tempt him. This is our best chance, he said. If I can isolate the emergency uplink and push a burst packet through without waking the main routing system, we might get your evidence off station. Lyra stepped closer. The repaired regulator at her neck glowing softly beneath the edge of the smock collar. Might? That is the most romantic word an underfunded technician can offer. This time her smile stayed for a heartbeat longer. It changed her face in a way the customs lights never could, taking nothing from her dignity and somehow making it feel more real. Then it faded, replaced by something thoughtful. On my world, she said, when one person gives their word for another, it is called sole custody. Ethan paused with his multi-tool halfway to the relay housing. That sounds intense. It is. Her voice remained calm, but the weight inside it deepened. It means the promise is not measured by success. It is measured by burden. Once spoken, the one who gives protection accepts a share of shame, punishment, exile, or loss meant for the other. It is considered sacred because only the powerful can survive it. Ethan looked at her fully then, at the tired grace in her posture, at the seriousness with which she offered the truth, and at the old fear now shifting into something larger inside his chest. "And you think I made that vow without understanding it?" "I know you did," Lyra said. "That is why I cannot stop thinking about it." The relay bank hummed faintly under Ethan's hand. Outside the chamber, through layers of pipe and steel, came another distant sound of movement, closer now, methodical and searching. He turned back to the open panel, but Lyra's words stayed with him like heat. On her world, promises belonged to the powerful. On his, they were supposed to belong to anyone decent enough to mean them. And for the first time that night, Ethan understood that what had shocked her was not his courage. It was the possibility that a man with no rank, no wealth, and no protection of his own had chosen to carry someone else's burden simply because it was the right thing to do. The old relay panel gave off the faint warm smell of dust cooking on tired circuitry as Ethan Cole slid his multi-tool beneath a corroded latch and eased the inner housing open. Inside, the hardware looked exactly like Meridian Gate on its bad days, patched, overworked, and still somehow stubbornly alive. Thin status lights glowed a weak amber through the grime. A cooling fan turned with a soft, uneven rasp. Ethan could feel the small steady vibration of residual current through the metal frame, a pulse so faint most people would have called it dead. He had spent half his adult life listening for systems that were not dead yet, and this one was still trying. Lyra Vale stood close enough to catch the lantern glow, her borrowed gray smock softening her outline, the repaired regulator at her neck holding a quiet blue-green line beneath her skin. The tunnel chamber around them felt narrower now, not because the walls had moved, but because the night had. Every minute seemed to press inward with the weight of approaching choices. Ethan clipped a bypass lead onto the relay contacts and brought up a diagnostic screen on the field reader. Strings of old service code crawled across the cracked display in pale green. "All right," he murmured. "Do not embarrass me in front of the mysterious off-world witness." Lyra watched the scrolling text with careful attention. "You speak to your machines as though they have feelings. Only the sensitive ones." A soft sound left her then, lighter than a laugh but warmer than silence, and Ethan found himself glancing at her before he could stop it. The change in her was not dramatic. It was smaller, and because it was smaller, it mattered more. The guarded frost in her expression had thinned. She still carried dignity like armor, but now there was something human in the way she stood beside him, not above him, not apart from him, but beside. "Why did you really do it?" she asked. Ethan kept his eyes on the relay readout for a second longer than necessary. The fan inside the panel clicked once, caught, and resumed spinning. Water moved through the conduit behind them with a steady hollow rush. "You mean besides my lifelong commitment to catastrophic timing?" "I mean the customs hall." Her voice remained low and calm, but there was no distance in it now. "You looked at a stranger and accepted consequences most people would not accept for family." Ethan swallowed. The air in the chamber felt warmer suddenly, closer. He adjusted a voltage dial that did not need adjusting just to give his hands something to do. "I had a younger sister," he said. "Emily. She was the kind of person who believed kindness was a job, not a mood. When we were kids, she used to get furious at adults for waiting around. Waiting for permission. Waiting for the right person. Waiting for someone more important to step in and do the decent thing." He smiled without meaning to, though it hurt a little. "She said people treated goodness like a management position." Lyra listened without interrupting, and somehow that made it easier to continue. "A few years ago she got sick. Hospital kind of sick. Nothing dramatic, just long bright hallways, coffee that tasted like burnt paper, and too many forms. One night she asked me why people always act like compassion belongs to whoever has authority. Why they think you need rank to protect somebody." He tightened the final lead into place and stared at the old relay as though it had the answer. "I did not have one then. Still do not. But when I saw you in that corridor, I heard her asking the question again." For a long moment, the only sound between them was the whisper of old electronics and the deep mechanical heartbeat of the station. Then Lyra said, very quietly, on my world, they teach us that power gives a promise weight. Tonight you are teaching me the opposite. Ethan looked up. Her pale eyes held his with that same startling clarity from customs, but there was no suspicion left in them now. Only recognition. Not of who he was in any grand sense, but of what kind of choice he had made. No, he said, softer than before. Power just makes promises easier to keep. Something in her face shifted at that, something deep enough to make the air feel different. The relay reader chirped before either of them could say more. Ethan looked down at the screen as lines of code resolved into a narrow transmission path. One emergency uplink, isolated and unstable, just as he had hoped. He pulled the crystal wafer from his pocket, slotted it into the transfer bridge, and began the upload. A thin progress bar crept across the reader. 5%. 11. 17. Ethan held his breath without realizing it. Lyra leaned in, close enough that he could feel the cooler edge of her presence against the heat of the panel. 24%. 31. Then the relay gave a harsh digital tone and froze. Every indicator light on the housing went white. Ethan's stomach dropped. That is not good, he said. I was beginning to understand your tone system, Lyra replied. That means very bad. The field reader flashed a routing notice across the screen in sharp official text. Emergency uplink locked by executive override. Authorized traffic redirected to Observation Spire relay control. Ethan stared at the words, the stale dust smell suddenly sour in his nose, and understood exactly what it meant. Whoever was protecting the lie had not just locked the network. They had pulled the only remaining clean route up to the highest communications point on the station, a place no restricted maintenance tech was supposed to get within 100 yards of. Somewhere far above them, beyond decks of steel and glass and people who thought rules only applied downward, the station had just told him where the truth needed to go next. For a second Ethan Cole just stared at the frozen display, the white executive override notice burning against the cracked green screen like something unreal, something that belonged to cleaner people on cleaner decks with polished shoes and titles longer than their conscience. The relay fan kept rasping inside the housing. The lantern hummed softly on its bracket. Water moved behind the walls in long patient channels, indifferent to corruption, deadlines, or the small human panic tightening around Ethan's ribs. He pulled the crystal wafer free before the locked uplink could try to handshake again and slid it back into his shirt pocket with fingers that suddenly felt less steady than he wanted. Observation Spire, he said, more to the air than to Lyra. Of course they would route it there. Lyra Vale stood very still beside him, pale eyes fixed on the screen until the override message timed out and the relay returned to its weak amber sleep. What is Observation Spire? She asked. Ethan let out a breath and reached for the lantern. The top communications level. Publicly it is a ceremonial broadcast deck, diplomatic receptions, panoramic windows, official announcements against the stars. In practice it is where sensitive traffic gets polished before anyone important has to look at it. He closed the relay housing with a dull metallic click. I have been there once. Maintenance sublevel only. New Year's reception. A decorative waterfall pump failed because someone thought elegant water should defy plumbing. Lyra watched him lift the toolbox. Can we reach it? Ethan gave a thin tired smile. That is a very optimistic use of the word can. They moved back into the tunnel, the lantern throwing a narrow amber path over old rivets and patched seams. The chamber behind them fell dark at once, swallowed by the station's deeper silence. Ethan kept one hand near the taped pocket over the crystal and the other on the toolbox handle, its weight grounding him against the speed of his own thoughts. Observation Spire sat near the crown of Meridian Gate, above customs, above administration, above the levels where people like Ethan were expected to remain useful and invisible. His restricted badge would not open a janitor closet up there now, let alone a controlled relay room. The problem was not the climb. It was the doors, the scans, the polite layers of denial built to keep ordinary people from interrupting extraordinary lies. His tablet vibrated again. This time the caller ID made him stop walking. Nolan Reyes. Ethan stared at the name and felt a different kind of dread settle in. Nolan was a senior systems contractor, one of the few friends Ethan had managed to keep after years of missed shifts, broken overtime promises, and the general wear of station life. Smart, careful, annoyingly decent when it was convenient, and too close to administration to call at this hour for anything good. Lyra noticed the change in his face. Bad? Ethan answered the call on audio. That depends what you want. Nolan's voice came through low and urgent, with background noise Ethan recognized instantly as the upper service grid near administration. Clean air systems. Better speakers. Money in the walls. I want you to listen for once, Nolan said. They are escalating this, Ethan. Your bond file is no longer a customs issue. Executive office is involved. Ethan kept walking, slower now. I gathered that from the part where they locked an emergency relay with executive override. Silence on the line. Then Nolan exhaled softly. Then you already know you are in over your head. Ethan looked ahead into the narrow run of tunnel and answered with more calm than he felt. That has been true since about 9 o'clock. Nolan did not laugh. Turn her in. The words landed with a quietness that made them worse. Say you panicked. Say she misled you. Say anything believable. I can help smooth the record if you do it now. Housing review gets dropped. Payroll restriction gets reversed. You keep your badge. You keep your life. Ethan felt the heat of the pipes along one side of the tunnel and the cool dampness of the opposite wall, like the station itself had split into two arguments. Lyra said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence beside him had become its own form of trust, and somehow that made Nolan's offer sound smaller than it would have an hour ago. And what happens to her? Ethan asked. Nolan paused just long enough to answer honestly without meaning to. That is above my level. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. There it was. The great machine of polite harm. Nobody choosing, everybody participating. He opened them again and kept walking. Then it is above mine too, he said. Because I already gave my word. Nolan's voice sharpened. Your word does not matter to these people. Ethan glanced at Lyra, at the quiet strength returning to her posture, at the danger and dignity of her all at once, and felt something inside him settle into place. Maybe not, he said. But it matters to me. He ended the call before Nolan could answer. For a few steps the only sound was the hollow ring of his boots and the steady breathing of the woman beside him. Then Lyra spoke, very softly. He offered you your life back. Ethan tightened his grip on the toolbox and kept moving toward the upper decks neither of them should have been able to reach. No, he said. He offered me comfort. There is a difference. The climb back toward the upper levels felt longer than it should have, as if Meridian Gate itself were testing whether Ethan Cole meant what he had already said. The service route narrowed into a vertical access run lined with warm conduit and old ladder rungs polished by decades of maintenance boots. The air changed the higher they went. Less rust, less trapped heat, more filtered chill, and that sterile citrus clean scent the executive decks pumped through their vents to make power smell like order. Ethan hated it on instinct. It reminded him of offices where people signed elegant documents that turned into ugly consequences 2 floors down. Lyra Vale climbed behind him in steady silence, the repaired regulator at her neck keeping its quiet glow, the gray smock softening her outline but not her presence. At the final hatch below Observation Spire support level, Ethan stopped and listened. Voices beyond the panel. Not many. Calm. Organized. The worst kind. He set the toolbox down and checked the maintenance schematic stenciled beside the latch. One corridor led left to decorative systems and viewing glass infrastructure. The other opened toward the civic promenade beneath the spire, a public plaza where official receptions, arrival ceremonies, and polished speeches were staged beneath a ceiling full of stars. He could already picture it: white floors, high glass, too much light, the kind of place where truth got dressed up before anyone was allowed to hear it. "There are too many scans near the relay core," he said quietly. "If I try to ghost us through service access, we get flagged before we reach the doors." Lyra studied his face with that unnerving clarity of hers. "But the promenade is public." Ethan nodded once. "Public means visible. Visible means harder to disappear quietly." Her eyes narrowed, not in suspicion now but in understanding. "You are planning something reckless." He gave her a tired look. "I am a maintenance technician with limited options. Reckless is just another word for initiative." The corner of her mouth shifted, but the hint of warmth in it faded almost immediately. "If you step into that plaza with me, they will isolate us both." Ethan looked at the sealed hatch, at the faint rim of white light around its edges, and felt the whole night gather into a single hard truth. He had spent hours trying to sneak goodness through broken machinery, as if decency needed permission from systems designed to smother it. Maybe that had been the mistake. Maybe the only way through people like this was straight through the middle, where everyone could see. He turned to Lyra and reached into his shirt pocket. The crystal wafer caught the low service light in a pale green glint as he placed it in her hand. Her fingers closed around it instantly. "If they pull attention toward me, you had left the second hatch opens," he said. "Maintenance gallery wraps behind the ceremonial wall. There should be a relay service conduit at the rear spine. Ugly, old, probably half illegal. My kind of architecture." Lyra did not move. "You are asking me to leave you." "I am asking you to finish this." Her expression changed then, and because it changed so little, Ethan felt it harder. Beneath the dignity and intelligence and careful distance, there was fear now. Not for herself. For him. "On my world," she said softly, "to accept sole custody and then surrender the bearer is considered the deepest dishonor." Ethan let out a quiet breath. "Good thing I am not surrendering you." He picked up the toolbox, straightened, and keyed the hatch release. The locks clicked. Bright civic light spilled into the access shaft, clean and almost colorless after the amber dimness below. Beyond it came the soft echo of footsteps, a fountain somewhere, the low murmur of people who still believed this was an ordinary station night. Ethan stepped closer to the threshold and looked back at Lyra one last time. Her blue-green skin seemed almost silver under the leak of upper-deck light. Her pale eyes held his with a steadiness that made lying impossible. "If they ask who is responsible," he said, voice low and even, "they get my name. If their law needs someone to answer for you, they can write down mine." For one suspended second she just stared at him, as if the words themselves had struck deeper than fear. Then the hatch finished opening, and Meridian Gate's polished upper world spread out before them in glass, light, and waiting witnesses. The civic promenade of Observation Spire looked less like part of a station and more like a promise someone wealthy had made to themselves. White stone composite curved beneath Ethan Cole's boots in clean sweeping lines that reflected the overhead light like pale water. Above, the glass dome opened onto the starfield, black and endless, with Meridian Gate's outer traffic blinking in precise slow arcs beyond it. A decorative fountain sent silver sheets of water down a suspended wall beside a cluster of diplomatic banners, and the air smelled faintly of citrus polish, cold glass, and expensive quiet. Ethan had never liked places that tried this hard to look innocent. The moment he stepped out of the service hatch, 3 security officials turned toward him from the far side of the promenade. No raised voices. No sudden movement. Just the smooth fast attention of people who had been told exactly what to watch for. Across the plaza, a pair of station administrators stood near the relay. Access arch in dark formal coats, speaking in low controlled tones that stopped the second they saw him. He felt Lyra Vale remain one pace behind him, still within shadow, the crystal wafer hidden in her hand beneath the gray smock. This was the moment. The one where a decent man was supposed to understand scale and surrender to it. Ethan set the toolbox down on the polished floor with a metallic clunk that echoed farther than it should have. Heads turned. Nearby travelers paused. The fountain kept whispering down its glass wall as if nothing in the universe had changed. Ethan Cole, one of the officials called, voice amplified just enough to make the name travel. Your civilian bond is in violation. Step away from the protected individual and submit for review. Ethan felt his heartbeat in his throat, in his wrists, in the burned knuckle Lyra had touched below decks. Fear was still there, honest and cold. But beneath it something steadier had taken root over the course of the night. Not courage exactly. Obligation. He looked toward the relay arch, toward the polished lie of all this light, and answered in a voice that surprised even him by how level it sounded. If your review needs someone responsible, you can take me. A ripple of murmurs moved through the people gathering at the edges of the promenade. One administrator, tall and silver-haired, recovered first. You are in no position to negotiate terms. Ethan turned slightly so his words would carry not just to authority, but to everyone now listening. I am not negotiating. I am stating a fact. She is under my protection. The sentence hung in the bright air like something too simple to survive there. For half a second nobody moved. Then Lyra stepped past him. Not hurriedly. Not dramatically. She simply moved forward with the kind of stillness that could silence a room more effectively than volume ever could. The oversized maintenance smock slipped back from her shoulders as she reached the center of the promenade, and under the white civic light the blue-green sheen of her skin no longer looked like vulnerability. It looked like rank. The pale line of the repaired regulator glowed at her neck like a living seal. When she spoke, her voice carried cleanly across the stone and glass without any amplification at all. Record this transmission under intersystem. Oversight privilege. Every official in sight froze. Even Ethan, who had been expecting something important, felt the ground inside him shift. Lyra raised her hand and opened her palm. The crystal wafer caught the dome light and flashed green. I am Lyra Vale, appointed external auditor to the Concord Relay Council, commissioned under sealed review authority to investigate corridor fraud, refugee trafficking by procedural debt, and executive collusion within Meridian Gate governance. The words landed one by one with the quiet force of doors unlocking. Faces changed around the plaza. Shock first. Then calculation. Then fear, but of a different kind now, the kind that arrived when polished systems realized someone had been watching from inside them all along. The silver-haired administrator stepped forward, composure cracking at the edges. That claim has not been verified. Lyra's eyes never left his. It was never meant to be. That was the purpose of the test. Ethan stared at her, at the dignity in her posture, at the terrible calm of someone finally done pretending to be powerless. Test. The word struck him almost physically. Lyra turned then, not to the officials, but to him. In front of the fountain, the station lights, the listening crowd, and the stars beyond the glass, she looked at Ethan Cole with a softness she had not permitted herself until now. I concealed my office because truth is easy to offer rank, she said. What is rare is the one who offers dignity before he knows whether it will profit him. The promenade had gone utterly still. Ethan could hear the water falling, the distant whisper of the ventilation system, the uneven rhythm of his own breathing. Then Lyra lifted the crystal toward the relay arch and said, with quiet finality, and now that the station has witnessed the bearer of my sole custody name himself freely, let every system on Meridian Gate record the part your laws forgot. He protected a person before he knew she had power. For one suspended breath, Meridian Gate forgot how to pretend. The administrators near the relay arch stood in the white light with their polished composure peeling away by degrees, not into panic, but into the colder thing beneath it, calculation interrupted by exposure. Around the promenade, travelers, staff, and late-shift personnel had gone motionless, all those ordinary witnesses suddenly transformed into something dangerous to people who relied on secrecy, an audience. Ethan Cole remained where he was beside the toolbox, his heart still striking hard against his ribs, the sound of the fountain unnaturally clear in the silence. Water whispered down the glass wall in shimmering sheets. Above them, the starfield burned black and infinite beyond the dome. For all the ceremony of Observation Spire, for all its clean lines and diplomatic polish, the place now felt stripped to its frame. Lyra Vale stepped toward the relay arch without haste, the crystal wafer held steady between two fingers. The security officials who had moved so confidently only moments earlier did not reach for her now. They looked instead to the administrators, waiting for permission that no longer seemed safe to give. Lyra did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Open the channel," she said. The nearest relay attendant, a young station tech in a formal gray sash, hesitated only long enough to realize every eye in the promenade was on him. Then he keyed the access panel. The arch brightened from within, filling with a soft lattice of blue transmission light that painted the floor in narrow bands. Ethan watched the silver-haired administrator step forward one last time, fighting for control of a room that had already slipped beyond him. External oversight credentials require validation through sealed review. Lyra turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. And sealed review has now been requested in a public witness environment, with active obstruction already observed. There was no anger in her tone. That made it worse for him. "Proceed," she said to the relay. The crystal met the receiving port with a quiet click. Then the spire came alive. Light raced up the arch in branching lines. A low resonant tone filled the promenade, deep and clear, followed by the cascade of verified transfer signals Ethan had only ever heard during emergency intersystem dispatches. Text began to appear in the air above the relay in clean floating bands, contract codes, route revisions, payment trails, authorization seals, all the elegant machinery of corruption rendered suddenly plain enough for anyone to understand. Ethan did not need to read every line to feel the change ripple through the crowd. Shock. Recognition. Anger. Not loud yet, but spreading. The kind that would not fit back into a closed room. Somewhere behind him he heard Nolan Reyes curse under his breath. Ethan turned and found him near the edge of the gathering, half out of uniform, face pale under the promenade lights. Nolan looked less like an accomplice than a man discovering too late what comfort had really cost. He met Ethan's eyes once, then looked away first. It should not have mattered. Somehow it did. Across the plaza, station security shifted from enforcement posture to containment, no longer trying to seize one frightened alien and one reckless maintenance tech, but trying to keep the whole polished fiction from collapsing under the weight of proof. It was already too late. Lyra withdrew the crystal from the relay and the transmission continued on its own, routed far beyond Meridian Gate now, out into systems where titles could not so easily smother testimony. Then she turned back toward Ethan. For the first time since he had seen her under the custom scanner, there was no barrier left in her expression, no rank, no test, no diplomatic reserve. Only quiet astonishment, and something deeper than gratitude. She crossed the bright floor until she stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the delicate pulse of light at her neck and the fatigue she had carried so elegantly all night. Then, before the station officials, the travelers, the relay staff, the watching stars, and everyone who had ever believed power alone made a life worth protecting, Lyra Vale lowered herself to one knee. The movement was graceful, deliberate, ancient in a way Ethan felt before he understood it. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through leaves. Ethan's throat tightened. "Lyra," he said softly, almost helplessly, "you do not have to do that." She looked up at him, pale eyes clear as winter light. "Yes," she said. "I do." Her hand came to rest lightly over her heart. "Before witness and record, I acknowledge Ethan Cole of Earth, who bore sole custody without title, without leverage, and without reward. Let it stand in law and memory that he guarded dignity before identity, and chose compassion before certainty." Ethan had no answer ready for that. No joke. No deflection. Just the burn in his knuckle, the weight of the night in his chest, and the impossible fact that kindness had somehow reached farther than all the station's locked doors. Around them, Meridian Gate remained bright and cold and vast, but something essential had shifted. Not in the stars. In the people standing beneath them. Ethan offered Lyra his hand, and when she took it and rose, the